Welcome to this episode of Diligent Institute's Inside Today's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to be talking about key board takeaways from new ESG shareholder capital research. And joining me is Paul Washington, who's the executive director of the ESG Center for the Conference Board. Welcome back, Paul.
Great to be with you, TK. Always enjoyed it.
So, probably a good place for us to start is to have you just quickly explain the research that you guys just completed. I know you always do a good job with this research, but just tell us a little bit about that if you could.
Sure. So the report is the role of the board in the era of ESG and stakeholder capitalism. It's the result of four Chatham House rule convenings with directors and executives. In fact, we had 240 directors and executives from 157 different organizations participate in those convenings. It was coupled with a survey of over 80 leading US firms.
I know there's a lot for us to cover, so let's dig right in. And why don't you share the first important takeaway that you saw from the research results?
Sure, there are a lot, but a key takeaway is that it's not necessary. In fact, it's kind of harmful for boards to try to reinvent the wheel here during this era. Companies are already addressing ESG topics, boards are already addressing them. So build off what you're currently doing. Having said that, there is a difference right now. So the fundamental role of the board is not changing, but it does have to step up in a way in serving as a strategic partner for management in making key choices during this era, because this is not a time where you're just responding to regulation and you've got to make sure management's doing its job. This is a time for making key choices as to balancing the interests of stakeholders, how fast you go on renewable energy, and so forth. And so it's really a time for the board to serve as a strategic partner with management.
It is interesting to watch how everybody's sort of dissecting it. And you can learn a lot from that. Particularly, it's interesting to see how some people are making sure they break it apart, and it's sort of attack each area independently rather than, as a total ESG. But what else did you see in the sense of results back from your survey?
Sure. Well, I think a couple of things were really interesting is the important role of the leadership directors on your board, the people who serve as committee chairs, the people who serve as either your non-executive chair or your lead independent director. They've always needed to have the respect of their fellow directors and fluency in the areas of their committee's expertise. But what we're seeing right now is to fulfill this strategic partnership role, the people in those roles also have to be open, not minded, willing to change, and so forth, and also able to collaborate very effectively with each other because, the ESG issues often fall under multiple committee jurisdictions. Sometimes there's white space. So you need collaboration. The second thing is that companies may be doing a little bit of checking the box when it comes to assigning ESG responsibilities around to different committees. And one thing to think about is there are some issues that shouldn't sit necessarily with a committee, but with a full board. So, for example, if you're serious about integrating sustainability into your business strategy, you want to make sure that it's built into your products and services you sell, into the products and services you buy, and into your operations. And those areas don't usually fall under a current board committee. They certainly may not fall under your nominating committee. Those may rest with the full board.
One of the things that was interesting when I had the quick peek at this research results, Paul, was I noticed there was a meaningful highlight which touched on engagement, which sort of touched a hot button for me. So, explain to our audience what you found out about engagement relative to the survey results.
For boards to stay on top of um, how the company is serving stakeholders, multiple stakeholders, its investors, its employees, its customers, and for it to stay on top of the relationship that the company has with those different stakeholders, right? Two slightly different things. The board will naturally rely on a lot of data from management, right? And that's absolutely okay. But to stay ahead of the curve, there is really no substitute for board members having direct engagement with investors and other stakeholders, including employees and so forth, and sometimes with communities. We've seen that in some companies. So, that combination of firsthand experience with broader data is something that I think a lot of companies ought to be looking at. And frankly, smaller companies aren't doing this. Most big US companies have a program of engaging with shareholders between their directors and shareholders. Smaller companies just don't. And that's a significant area of vulnerability, including for shareholder activism.
A lot of organizations, stakeholders really want to talk to board members. Okay. It's one thing to talk to a CEO or a CFO, but you really have to make sure that you're including board members, in those engagements, or I'm not sure that you're sort of fulfilling the true meaning of the board engaging.
Yeah, and on that front, a small point, but for those directors who are engaging, you want to make sure the rest of the board knows what happens in those engagement discussions. Because even in companies where there's a high level engagement with investors and others, if word doesn't get out to the rest of the board as to what they talked about, then the other directors actually feel in the dark.
I know there's a lot to cover, but what else sort of caught your attention when you saw the results, Paul?
Right. So one area that caught me by surprise, but I thought was a sort of breakthrough moment, is that a lot of companies, have siloed evaluations. So the board evaluates the company's performance. Then the compensation committee evaluates senior management's performance, and then the board evaluates its own performance. There should be connectivity and alignment between those three levels of evaluation: board, management, and the company management and the board. So, for example, if the transition to renewable energy is a significant business priority for you, it should show up when the board's evaluating the company's performance, management's performance, and its own performance. So, look for greater alignment of those three levels of evaluation.
Yeah, evaluations are, we've seen when the board's done the evaluations of themselves that they're very good at performing the evaluation. They're not so great on taking action and having the difficult conversations. And I assume that that's a challenge at every level where there's results coming in from evaluations. It's one thing to do it, it's another thing to make sure that you're acting on the results.
Right. And I think an important point is the board evaluation shouldn't just focus on governance level issues. Okay, do we have the right committee structure or meetings going well? All that. They actually need to think about whether they are substantively adding value to the discussions of these key strategic issues. So there's an angle here that goes beyond a sort of traditional checklist.
Paul, we've only had a chance here to sort of touch on some of the major highlights out of the survey. Where can people get a copy of the research report? Because there's much more in it than we've had a chance to touch on.
Sure, there's a lot more. In fact, there are five separate reports that address this, but they're all bite sized. So you can go to TCB, that stands for the conference board, tcb.org, and look for the role of the board in the area of ESG and stakeholder capitalism, and you'll see the report the reports that we produce.
Well, you guys at the conference board have done a great job of, reaching out, trying to get, dig a little deeper on these topics that people are struggling with at times. So I want to thank you for taking the time to come and sharing some of those highlights with the audience.
Absolutely, my pleasure, TK. Glad to spend time with you.
And that will conclude this edition of Diligent Institute's Inside Today's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.